The last thing Saravas heard before the comms went to static was her squadron leader's voice cutting through 3 layers of jamming to say her name, not her call sign, her name. That was how she knew it was bad. Kale Marin had been flying since before she was born. He had the hands of a surgeon and the patience of a man who'd waited out ambushes on 3 continents and 2 moons. He never used names on an open channel. Names made things personal, and personal got pilots killed. That was the rule. That had always been the rule. So when his voice came through the static, and he said, Sarah, like he was talking to his daughter, she already knew that Titan 4 was gone, and that he was going back for her. She keyed her transmitter twice, the old code, I see you, I'm with you. She didn't know if he received it. The battle above Kethvar Station had gone wrong in the way that battles always go wrong. Not all at once. In pieces, each piece small enough to explain away, until suddenly there was nothing left to explain. The Concorde's fighter wings had come in hard and fast, and for the first 17 minutes the UEF pilots had held the line, and then the Concorde had turned its ventral cannons on the station's power grid, and the whole electromagnetic picture changed. And suddenly half the squadron's targeting was running on estimates, and the other half wasn't running at all. Titan 4, Lieutenant Damaris Okafor, 26 years old, Kepler station-born, the pilot who hummed old Earth pop songs to herself during long patrols, and who owed Sarah 40 credits from a bet about whether the new mess cook could make real jerk chicken, had taken a rail slug through her port thruster housing. Not through her. The slug had missed her by centimeters. But the thruster had gone, and then her port stabilizer, and her fighter had begun to tumble in that particular slow-motion way that meant she was still alive but not for long. Kale had seen it. He'd been on an attack vector at the time, lined up on the Concorde's exposed sensor cluster, a shot that might have bought the whole squadron another 20 minutes of meaningful fight. He'd pulled off the vector. He'd gone back. Sarah had watched his fighter bank and dive. She'd watched the math of it, the fuel expenditure, the distance. The Concorde's rotational fire pattern. She'd know before she finished the calculation that he wasn't going to make it back to the fleet before the withdrawal burned. She'd told Command. Command had told her that the withdrawal timeline was fixed. She'd asked for 60 seconds of cover. Command had said negative. She'd called them something that would have cost her a stripe under normal circumstances. And then she'd stopped talking and turned her fighter around. That was 8 minutes ago. Now the Concorde's fighters were behind her, and Kethvar Station was a debris field, and somewhere in the middle of that debris field were 2 UEF fighters and 2 pilots who had made the kind. That doesn't look like a decision when you're making it. Her instruments were singing. She had 3 separate damage alerts, and a coolant warning, and her fuel was already in the amber. And the Concorde's fighters were 4 minutes back and closing, and she couldn't see Kale on sensors because his transponder was dark, and she couldn't see Damaris at all. She flew into the debris field anyway. The wreckage of Kethvar Station spread across a volume of space, roughly 40 kilometers across and 9 deep. It had been a fuel processing platform, military grade, 8 years of construction, and the labor of 11,000 people, and the Concorde had taken it apart in just under 3 hours. What remained was a slow-moving constellation of twisted carbon fiber and ruptured fuel cells and, in the deeper sections, whole structural modules still intact, tumbling end over end, their interior lights still running, because nobody had told the power systems to stop. She cut her running lights and reduced thrust to minimum. On the Concorde's sensors she would look like debris. She would be debris, essentially. A small human thing drifting among the wreckage of something large, hoping that the people who made the wreckage had already moved on to their next target. She found Kale's fighter by the distress beacon he'd embedded in a piece of hull plating. The beacon was broadcasting on a frequency that hadn't been in active military use for 30 years, which meant it wouldn't register on anything built in the last decade. He'd found it somewhere. Some salvager's trick from a life before the war. She picked up the signal and homed in on it, and found Fiamastir wedged into the shadow of a rotating structural module, his running lights off, his hull dark. She pulled alongside and waited. His canopy cracked open. She watched him pull himself out of the cockpit using just his arms, And she understood then that his lower suit had lost pressure. The way he moved. Care with which he favored his right side. And she didn't let herself think about what that meant for anything beyond the next 5 minutes. She extended her fighter's recovery arm, the one meant for retrieving disabled drones, and he grabbed it, and she reeled him in, and when he was close enough, she cracked her own canopy and reached out and took his hand and pulled him across the gap. He landed in her cockpit like a man who'd been held together by will for the last 10 minutes and had just run out of will. She got the canopy sealed. He took off his helmet. There was blood on his left ear, dried, and his face was the color of old concrete. "Damaris," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he pulled his helmet back on. "Concorde fighters, 4 minutes, maybe 3 now. Fuel? Enough." He didn't ask enough for what. He knew what enough meant in this context. It meant enough to run, and not enough to fight, which was the definition of their situation in full. She took them deeper into the debris field. The thing about flying in a debris field is that it requires a particular kind of attention that is very different from combat attention. Combat attention is fast and decisive. The mind moving at the speed of threat assessment, the body reacting before the thought is fully formed. Debris field attention is slow and patient, is the steady management of 1,000 small variables, is the ability to look at a tumbling piece of structural beam and understand exactly how it will move over the next 40 seconds and plan your course around that future position, not the current one. It is, in some ways, a more demanding kind of attention. There is no adrenaline to carry you through it. It is just you and the physics and the patience to wait. Sarah had flown debris fields before. She had a feel for the rhythm of wreckage, the way large objects create currents that smaller objects follow, pockets of relative stillness that form in the lee of tumbling mass. She took them down through the upper layer, the fine debris, the dust and fragments, and into the middle layer, where the structural modules were, and she found a pocket between 3 rotating sections that was, for the moment, calm. She killed the main drive. They drifted. In the silence she could hear KL breathing, measured, controlled. The breathing of a man managing pain he wasn't going to mention. "Your ribs," she said. "2, he said, maybe 3. Right side? Left. The egress handle caught me. She didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything useful to say. She checked her sensors, passive only, nothing that would broadcast, and watched the Concorde's fighters enter the debris field 2 kilometers above them. There were 4 of them. She'd expected 2. 4 meant they were committed. 4 meant whoever was running the Concorde's fighter wing had made a judgment that a damaged UEF, fighter hiding in wreckage, was worth 4 ships to hunt down. She didn't know if that said something about the Concorde's resources or something about their own reputation, and she didn't have time to work out which. She watched the 4 contacts move across her passive sensor display. They were flying a grid pattern, methodical. The way you fly a search when you have time and fuel and the confidence that your target isn't going anywhere. They weren't rushing. That was the thing that struck her. They weren't rushing. She had, in her career, encountered many different flavors of enemy. She had fought opponents who were aggressive, and opponents who were cautious, and opponents who were skilled, and opponents who were lucky. She had fought people who wanted to win, and people who wanted to prove something, and people who were simply doing their jobs. But she had rarely fought someone who was methodical. Methodical was harder. Methodical didn't make mistakes out of eagerness. Methodical closed every door. One of the 4 contacts separated from the others. She watched it move toward them. It wasn't moving fast. It was moving with the same measured patience as the others, but its heading was wrong for a grid search. It was moving with direction. "They have us," Kale said. "Not yet. That heading. I see it." She thought about her options. She could run, push the drive to full and try to exit the debris field before they could close the distance. She had maybe 90 seconds of full thrust, and the exit was 40 seconds away at full thrust, and they had 4 ships with full tanks. She could fight, push the drive to full, and come up under the incoming fighter before it could get a targeting solution. Take it out, deal with the remaining 3 from a position of partial advantage. She had 1 full magazine and 2 partial, and a pilot who was managing broken She could hide, stay dark, stay still, trust the debris to mask their signature. The incoming fighter was 30 seconds away. 40. It had slowed. She made the decision that wasn't a decision, the one that announced itself complete before she consciously arrived at it. Pushed the nose down and lit the drive at 15%. Enough to move, not enough to be a clear signature, and slid them behind the largest of the 3 rotating modules. She matched its rotation. They moved with it, the module between them and the incoming fighter, turning as it turned. The incoming fighter passed their position at a distance of 200 meters. She watched it on passive sensors. It continued on its heading for another 30 seconds, then altered course slightly, then altered again, and she understood that it had lost them and was trying to reacquire without admitting that it had lost them. "Nice," Kale said quietly. "Don't thank me yet." The remaining 3 had altered their grid pattern. They were tightening it. She could see the logic of it. They knew the UEF fighter was in this volume, and they were going to find it by eliminating possibilities one by one. It was a slow process, but it was an effective process. She had perhaps 12 minutes before they'd worked through enough of the field to make her position untenable. She needed a path out. The debris field had 4 viable exit vectors, 2 of which were currently covered by the search grid, and 1 of which required fuel she didn't have. The 4th was deeper in, down through the dense core of the field, where the largest structural fragments were, where the navigation was hardest, and where, incidentally, the sensor environment was worst. Rock and metal and carbon were so dense that a fighter's passive sensors gave you maybe 2 seconds of warning on a collision, and your active sensors were useless because everything bounced. She'd never flown anything like it. She was reasonably certain no sane person had. She'd been in worse positions. She tried to remember one. "The deep transit," Kale said, "not a question." "Yeah," a long pause. "I've read the accounts of the survey drones they sent through during the initial mapping phase. Lost 6 out of 8. Those were drones. No human instinct. The 2 that made it through were also drones. Right, but the pilots controlling them were doing it from 2,000 kilometers away, with a signal delay of..." She stopped. "Stopped making this argument because it's making me less confident." He laughed. Him. She could hear it in the cutoff at the end. But he laughed. "Go," he said. She went. The deep transit was less a flight path than a sustained negotiation with physics. The structural modules at the core of the debris field were not tumbling. Most of them. They were oscillating, slowly, in complex interference patterns, each one responding to the gravitational pull of its neighbors. The whole system, locked in a dance that would persist for decades, until the orbital decay brought everything down into Kethvar's atmosphere to burn. The navigation problem was not dodging obstacles in isolation. The navigation problem was predicting the future positions of dozens of interdependent objects and finding the moving window of space where her fighter could fit. Not now, but when she arrived. She flew on instinct and calculation in equal measure. She moved the stick with her whole body, not just her hands, feeling the fighter's responses as an extension of herself, making 100 small corrections that she was not fully aware of making. Kale kept his eyes on the sensor display and called out closing obstacles. 9 o'clock, 14 seconds. High at 2, rolling right. Gap at 11. 300 meters, opening. And she trusted his calls the way she trusted her own hands, without verification, without hesitation. The Concorde's fighters followed them in. Not all 4. 2 of them had the sense or the orders to hold at the field's edge. 2 came in behind her, and she could hear the gap in the sensor chatter that meant they were good. Not reckless, not glory hunting, but good. The kind of good that is a problem. The lead pursuer was closer than she liked. She'd lost a second when a module had unexpectedly shifted its oscillation. Something had hit it. Debris on debris. And that second had become 3 seconds. And 3 seconds had become a closing distance that was now uncomfortable. She needed to put something between her and the pursuit. The largest single object in the deep transit was a fuel processing sphere, intact, 40 meters in diameter, tumbling in a broad, slow ellipse. She'd noted it when she entered the transit zone, filed it as an obstacle, moved on. Now she looked at it differently. It was tumbling. The tumble had a period of about 22 seconds. In 11 seconds, it would be between her current position and the pursuing fighter's current position, and it would stay there for about 4 seconds before the tumble brought it clear again. 4 seconds was enough. She changed course toward the sphere instead of away from it, which was the thing the pursuing pilot would not expect, because the sphere was the wrong direction. Because turning toward the largest obstacle in the field made no sense. She felt the pursuing pilot's hesitation on the sensor display, a fractional change in heading that represented a mind catching up to something it hadn't predicted, and she used that hesitation. She flew directly at the sphere, close enough that the turbulence from the venting atmosphere inside its cracked hull shook her fighter, and she pulled up and over the sphere at the precise moment that the sphere's tumble brought it between her and the pursuit. She didn't look back. Looking back was for people who had already survived. She pushed the drive to 60%, the most she could afford, and drove for the exit vector. She heard the impact before her sensors registered it. The sound was transmitted through the hull of her fighter by the shockwave that passed through the debris field around her. A low, reverberant concussion that said something large had hit something else large. Her sensors caught up a second later. One of the pursuing contacts was gone, not gone from range. Gone, the second pursuer had stopped. She kept flying. The next vector opened in front of her like a door, the dense debris giving way to sparse debris giving way to open space. And she came through it at 60% thrust, and throttled back and let the fighter coast and checked her fuel and found she had enough for 8 minutes of standard thrust, which was not enough to reach the nearest UEF relay beacon, but was enough to reach the beacon she'd placed 6 hours ago, in anticipation of exactly this kind of situation. She did not place anticipation beacons as a matter of standard procedure. She had started doing it 3 months ago, after an operation in the Silu corridor had gone wrong, in ways that she still didn't like to think about. She did it now automatically, quietly, without telling anyone, the way you do things that you know are technically excessive, and that you do anyway, because the alternative is not doing them. She composed a short message on the tight beam transmitter and sent it toward the beacon. Then she checked on Kale. He was still conscious, which was more than she'd hoped for toward the end of the transit. His color was somewhat better. He had his left arm pressed against his ribs. Not because it helped, she knew, but because the pressure gave the body something to push against. 2.5 hours to the relay, she said. Maybe 3. The Concorde will have a search pattern up. Yes, our fuel doesn't cover a deviation. No. He thought about this, so we fly straight and hope. We fly straight and hope, she agreed. He nodded slowly, the nod of someone accepting an equation they don't like. Damaris, he said again. She didn't say anything this time either. There wasn't anything useful to say, and they both knew it, and the knowing was enough. She set the course and engaged the autopilot, and settled back in the seat, which was not designed for 2 people, but which was, barely, large enough for 2 people if one of them was Kale's size, and was willing to lean to the left. He leaned to the left. She flew. Pursuit found them 40 minutes later. She had expected it. Had been tracking the probability of it the entire time. Watching it climb as her fuel constraints narrowed her option space, and the Concorde's search pattern covered more of the likely exit vectors from the debris field. The mathematics had always pointed to this encounter. She had simply been hoping the mathematics were wrong. They were not wrong. The contact appeared on her sensors at 300 kilometers and closing. Single ship. It was not closing fast, which was unusual. A normal intercept came in fast, closed the distance before the target could react. This one was coming in at a measured pace of something that had already done the math and knew it didn't need to hurry. She checked her own calculations against that assumption. Fuel state, her speed, the geometry. The nearest asteroid body large enough to offer any navigational options. The math agreed with the pursuer. It didn't need to hurry. Same one? Kale asked. Can't tell. She studied the sensor return. The drive signature was consistent with the ship class she'd been fighting earlier, but drive signatures weren't reliable identifiers. Possibly. The one that lost us in the field. Maybe. He was quiet for a moment. That one's good. Yes. She began running options. She had enough fuel to run for approximately 6 minutes at full thrust, which would not change the geometry in any meaningful way. She had a full magazine and 2 partials, which was enough for a fight if the fight was short. She had a co-pilot with broken ribs and no helmet. He'd left it back at his own fighter. And she hadn't remembered until now, hadn't thought to say bring your helmet. Which meant if her canopy took a hit, she was managing both the fighter and a medical emergency simultaneously. She had always, in every situation she'd ever been in, found something. Some angle, some option, some piece of the environment she could use. She looked at the environment now. Empty space. A distant star. The navigation buoy she'd placed 6 hours ago, currently behind them, already used. And ahead, at the edge of her sensor range, small feature she'd noted as irrelevant during her initial plot. A protoplanetary body, largely iron, roughly 3 kilometers across, airless, tectonically inert. A rock. A big rock. She thought about what a big rock offered in terms of tactical options and discovered that the answer was not much, if you thought about it in terms of the options she was used to having. But maybe something, if she thought about it differently. Pursuer was 200 kilometers out now. It had increased speed slightly, not dramatically, just enough to close the math. She opened a channel, standard hailing frequency. She had no particular expectation that the pursuer would respond. Silence required nothing from her, and she preferred to be doing something. Static, then after a moment, a voice. She had expected something. Some declaration, some demand, some form of communication that would tell her who and what she was dealing with. What she got was 4 words, translated through whatever system the Concorde used for standard, delivered in a tone that was not hostile, not taunting, simply factual. This engagement is concluded. She stared at her transmitter for a moment. It isn't actually, she said. No response. The contact continued its approach. She thought about those 4 words for a long moment. Not the meaning. The meaning was clear enough. Pursuer believed it had already won. The geometry and the fuel state and the math all supported that belief. She thought about the delivery, the absolute absence of affect. No pleasure in the trap, no contempt for the target, nothing personal. This was the voice of something that was simply completing a process, that had identified a problem, and was in the act of resolving it, that did not require her cooperation or her fear, or even her acknowledgement, that bothered her in a way that an angry or contemptuous enemy never had. An angry enemy makes mistakes. A contemptuous enemy underestimates. An enemy that feels nothing about you, that approaches you as a process to be completed. That enemy is only going to make the mistakes built into its plan, and only if you find them before it finishes. The rock, Kale said. Yes. What's your thinking? Honest answer, I'm making it up as I go. He was quiet for a moment. Good, he said. That's when you're best. She would think about that later, when there was a later. She filed it and focused. The protoplanetary body was ahead and slightly above her current heading. It was rotating, slowly. 1 revolution every 40 minutes or so, she estimated from the changing albedo patterns on her sensor display. Its surface was irregular. Iron-rich bodies usually were. Ridges and impact craters, and on the sunward side, a thermal differential that created a faint sensor shadow at certain angles. A sensor shadow. She began a very slow course adjustment, not toward the rock. Parallel to the rock's heading, drifting gradually into an approach angle that would, if held for long enough, bring her into the sensor shadow from the pursuer's angle of view. She made the adjustment at minimum thrust, smoothed it into the autopilot's course corrections, made it look like drift. The pursuer was 120 kilometers out. She made another small adjustment, then another. He sees it, Kale said. She checked the sensor display. The pursuer had altered course slightly, matching her drift, maintaining its angle. It saw her adjustment and it was correcting for it, because it had already done the math on the rock, and it knew that her approach angle led nowhere useful. The math was right. Current approach angle did lead nowhere useful. She intended to change the approach angle at the last possible moment. Pursuer was 80 kilometers out. She ran the numbers. She needed to enter the sensor shadow at the rock's surface at a specific point. A long, shallow ridge on the terminator. The line between the sunward and dark faces, where the thermal differential was sharpest. She needed to get there before the pursuer could get a firing solution. And she needed to do it at an angle that the pursuer wasn't currently, predicting she needed specifically to not be where the math said she would be. 60 kilometers. She watched the sensor display. Pursuer was steady on its heading, methodical. It was going to close to firing range, and then it was going to fire. And the geometry meant that she had very few places to be that were not in the firing solution. It had been patient, and it had been thorough, and it had, she thought, made one mistake. It had decided the engagement was concluded before the engagement was concluded. She waited. 40 kilometers. She waited 30. She cut the drive entirely and let the fighter coast. Without thrust, she was debris. Without thrust, course prediction algorithms that the pursuer was using updated with her current vector, and calculated her future position, and found it somewhat different from where they'd expected, which caused, she was betting, a small processing adjustment, a fractional moment of recalculation. She used the fractional moment, full thrust, not her current heading, a new heading, down and left by 40 degrees hard over, the fighter straining at the vector change, Kale pressing back against the seat, with a sound that he managed to keep mostly internal, the drive burning fuel she didn't technically have, at a rate she couldn't sustain for more than 20 seconds. 20 seconds was what she needed. Sewer fired. She saw the targeting solution bloom on her sensors, and she was already gone from it, was already somewhere else, and she heard the rounds pass at a distance that was close enough to register, and far enough to not matter. She pulled the thrust back as she hit the terminator line and dove into the sensor shadow of the ridge, and killed the drive and let the fighter fall against the rock's surface, matching its rotation, tucking into the shadow of a 3-kilometer iron body. She looked at her fuel gauge. She had enough for 43 seconds of full thrust. She looked at the time. The pursuit ship was on the far side of the rock from her. She had however long it took it to come around the long way, or to go up and over, or to calculate that the sensor shadow was exactly what she'd used it for, and adjust accordingly. She did not know how long that was. She knew it was not very long. She looked at the ridgeline above her. The iron surface was irregular, full of the kind of features that formed when a body like this had spent 4 billion years being struck by smaller bodies. It was, in its way, a kind of record. Every crater a collision, every ridge a fault, the whole surface a documentation of everything that had ever hit it, and where. She looked at the largest ridge. It ran along the terminator for about 3 kilometers, and it peaked at a height that was, relative to the surrounding terrain, significant. Relative to everything else, it was still a very small rock formation. But, relative to a fighter approaching at moderate speed in the dark, focused on a sensor return that was in a slightly different position. She looked at the sensor return, at the shadow, at the geometry. She thought about the 4 words. This engagement is concluded. She thought about the methodical closing pattern, the patience, the way it had followed her into the debris field and lost her and kept searching, the way it had picked up her trail and closed the distance and done the math and decided it had won. She thought, what does something that methodical do when the target appears on sensors right where it expects the target to be? It resolves the process efficiently, without deviation. It does not look at the ridge. She positioned her fighter at the far end of the ridge, in the shadow of the terminator, drive off, completely dark. Then she activated her emergency distress beacon. 1 pulse, 1 single ping, broadcasting on the military emergency frequency, bright and clear and impossible to miss, position that was directly in line with the ridge and slightly beyond it. 1 pulse, then off. She waited. She counted. Sewer came around the rock's limb at speed. She saw it on passive sensors, a bright, purposeful contact, moving at the velocity of something that had made a decision and was executing it. It had her beacon position. It was flying directly for that position. It was flying, therefore, directly along the ridgeline. She pushed the drive to full. She came up from the shadow of the terminator at an angle that put her above and behind the pursuer at a closing distance of 400 meters. She fired. She did not fire at the pursuer directly. She fired at the ridge. The rounds hit the iron face of the ridge, and the iron face of the ridge responded the way iron responds when struck hard enough. It shed fragments, fast-moving cloud of shrapnel, filling the space ahead of the pursuer at a density that no kinetic system could fully account for. Ease. The fragments were not coming from a weapon. They were coming from a planet. And planets are not targets that military threat assessment systems are calibrated to manage. She was already pulling away, banking hard, running on the last of her fuel when the sensor return of the pursuing ship did something sudden and comprehensive. She did not watch. She listened to her sensors, and they told her what they told her, and she filed it and kept flying. In the silence after, she could hear her own breathing. She could hear Kale's too, and she waited until both of them had settled before she spoke. "Relay beacon," she said. "Yes, 60 minutes out, maybe 70. Can we make it?" She checked the fuel state. "We can coast most of it." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "We're going to spend an hour floating in space on fumes." "We are. I was supposed to write a report this afternoon. The report can wait." He was quiet for a while. She watched the stars and managed the coasting trajectory and thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill she develops specifically for situations like this. For the time after the decision when there was nothing to do but wait, and the waiting was its own kind of hard. "She was good," Kale said. "Damaris, she was very good." "Yes. First solo intercept at 23. I pulled the records when she transferred in. She'd done something in the Salu approaches that her wing commander hadn't believed until he reviewed the telemetry. She told me about the Salu approaches. She said it was mostly luck. The best ones always say that. I know, they floated. The star ahead of them grew incrementally larger, the way stars do when you are approaching them at a speed that is meaningful to physics and insignificant to perception. I made the call, Kale said. I know. I'd make it again. I know that too. He didn't say anything else about it. She didn't need him to. The thing about flying with someone long enough is that the language between you becomes compressed, becomes efficient, becomes the minimum necessary to convey what needs to be conveyed. She knew what he meant. She knew what he was carrying. She would have made the same call, and she would carry the same thing. And they both understood this, and the understanding was the conversation. She checked the relay beacon's signal. Still there, still waiting. When we get back, she said. Yes. Full incident report. Going to need you to corroborate something. What? That the deep transit was navigable. That it can be done. He was quiet for a moment. Because someone else might need to know that. Later. He thought about it. It cost us almost everything. Yes. But it can be done. Another long pause. All right, he said. I'll corroborate it. She nodded and returned her attention to the stars. The relay beacon received her tight beam message 38 minutes later and rebroadcast it on the encrypted UEF frequency, pressed and tight beamed toward the nearest fleet element. 17 minutes after that, she received an acknowledgement. 22 minutes after that, she received a location and a rescue timeline. She calculated the intercept course and found that she had almost exactly the right amount of fuel remaining to reach it, which was the kind of coincidence that she had stopped believing in years ago, and which she nevertheless found, in this particular moment, unreasonably satisfying. She reached up and unsealed her helmet and took it off. The cockpit air tasted like recycled oxygen and the ghost of someone else's coffee, which was what cockpit air always tasted like, but underneath that was something else. Some quality that was not exactly fresh, but was not exactly stale either. And she breathed it in and let her shoulders come down for the first time in what felt like hours, which it was. She looked at the stars. The war had been going on for 3 years. In 3 years, she had learned things she had not expected to learn, and lost people she had not expected to lose, and made decisions she had not expected to have to make. She had learned that the enemy was not a monolith. It was composed of individuals who made individual decisions, some of whom were methodical, and some of whom were reckless, and some of whom, perhaps, she would never fully understand. She had learned that understanding the enemy was not the same as defeating them, and was not the same as surviving them. She had learned that survival was its own skill, separate from any other skill, composed of parts that were technical, and parts that were not technical at all. She had learned that the people who survived were not always the best pilots or the best fighters, or the most skilled or the most prepared. They were the ones who had someone to come back for. The ones who, in the moment when the calculation said give up, found a reason the calculation hadn't included. Damaris had hummed old Earth pop songs during long patrols. She had owed Sarah 40 credits. She had done something in the Silu approaches that her wing commander hadn't believed until he reviewed the telemetry. Sarah would write that down, somewhere, not in a report. In the thing she kept in her flight bag, the small notebook that she'd been filling for 3 years with names and things she remembered about the people who owned the names. She would write Damaris's call sign, and the date, and the thing about the Seloof approaches. And then she would close the notebook and put it back in the bag and keep flying. She put her helmet back on. Kale was asleep, or something close to it, the body's way of managing what the mind had been managing for too long. His breathing was steady. She watched the sensor display in the stars, and the slowly growing signal of the rescue elements, and she thought about how they would approach the incident report, and what she would recommend about the deep transit, and what Kale's medical evaluation would show, and how long before she was back in a fighter. She thought about the pursuer, about its patience and its method, about the 4 words it had said and the tone in which it had said them, about what it had been underneath its tactics, when you stripped away everything except what it had actually done. It had followed. It had been relentless. It had pushed through every obstacle and continued through every setback, and it had, in the end, committed to a targeting solution without looking at the ridge. That was the thing about Methodical. Methodical was built for a world that followed its own predictions. And the world, in Sarah's experience, persistent and occasionally useful habit of not doing that. The rescue ships appeared on her sensors 40 minutes later. 4 of them, which was more than she'd expected. And which meant someone had read the beacon traffic and made a judgment call about what the situation required. She keyed the transmitter. Titan lead, this is Titan 2. We're here. We're intact. Coming to you now. A voice she recognized, her wing commander, Kraka, who was not a man who expressed emotion through his voice, and who was expressing something she couldn't quite name through his now, came back immediately. Titan 2, we have you on screen. What's your status? She checked the fuel gauge. She checked Kale. She checked the sensor display, empty of threats, full of friendly returns. The way a sensor display looked, when a thing that had been very bad had resolved into something she could manage. Operational, she said. Some maintenance items, nothing immediate. And Titan lead? She looked at him. He'd woken up or come close to it. His eyes were open. He was looking at the rescue elements on the sensor display with an expression she recognized. The expression of someone confirming that the thing they've been working toward is real and not a function of oxygen debt or wish fulfillment. He reached over and put his hand briefly on her forearm. Then he took it away. Titan lead is with me, she said into the transmitter. He'll need medical on arrival. Nothing immediate. Copy. Come on in. Titan 2. She set the final intercept course. She had fuel for approximately 3 minutes of thrust, which was exactly enough. She thought this was probably coincidence. She was fine with that. Coincidence was another word for the universe deciding, on a case-by-case basis, that the math could be slightly wrong. She had, in her experience, found that to be one of the more reliable things about the universe. She flew them home. The debrief took 2 hours and covered, in detail, the tactical decisions she had made, the damage to both fighters, the status of the Kethvar station operation, and the fate of Lieutenant Damaris Okafor, which was entered into the record in the precise, factual language that the record required, and which she recited in the precise, controlled tone that the situation required. And then she went somewhere quiet and sat with it for a while. The report she filed 3 days later, Keel, was out of the medical bay and able to corroborate, contained a section on the navigability of the Kethvar debris field's deep transit zone. She wrote it carefully. She wrote it in the language of a pilot who had done it once and had the telemetry to prove it, and who wanted someone who came after her to know that it was possible. She wrote, "The key variable is not the skill level of the pilot, though skill is required. Key variable is the willingness to remain committed to a solution past the point at which the solution appears to have failed. The debris field creates the impression of impossible complexity. The impression is accurate. Within the complexity, there are always, channels of relative stillness, and a pilot who is willing to keep looking will find them. She wrote this, and she believed it, and she sent the report. Then she went back to her fighter, to the maintenance crews had worked on for 60 hours, and which was now, they told her, better than new. A phrase she had always found slightly suspicious, because nothing was better than new, which she understood to mean that they had done their best and their best was good. And she sat in the cockpit for a while without going anywhere. The cockpit was quiet. The station's hangar was active around her, the sounds of work and voices and machinery, but inside the cockpit it was quiet. The way cockpits are quiet when they are not moving. She put her hands on the controls without engaging anything. She felt the stick, and the throttle, and the familiar specific weight of her helmet on her head. She thought about Damaris, briefly. She thought about Kale, who was 3 decks up in a recovery room, arguing with his physiotherapist about when he could return to flight status. She thought about the pursuer, and its 4 words, and the ridge. Then she stopped thinking about all of that, and looked at the hangar and the ships, and the people moving between them. She thought, we're still here. She thought, that's the thing, isn't it? We're still here. She reached down and found the small photograph she'd taped to the inside of the instrument panel 6 months ago. A picture taken at a base in the Kara system, the whole squadron together, Damaris on the far left making a face at the camera, Kale in the center, looking like he'd rather not have his picture taken. Sarah in the middle doing neither because she'd been the one holding the camera, and she looked at it for a while. Then she filed her flight plan for tomorrow's patrol. She had fuel. She had a fighter that was, they told her, better than new. She had a sector that needed watching, and a squadron that needed covering, and a relay beacon that needed positioning. The war, whoever anyone said, was not over. Not for her. She started the pre-flight sequence.